They were healers, midwives, widows, and outcasts, ordinary women living in quiet corners of medieval Europe. But in the blink of an eye, they became public enemies, dragged from their homes, tortured, and burned alive. Why? Not because of spells or demons, but because of a lie. A lie so powerful it weaponized fear, turned neighbors into executioners, and reshaped history for centuries. This wasn't about witchcraft, it was about control. Religious panic, political power grabs, and centuries of misinformation turned suspicion into slaughter. And at the heart of it all, a fabricated war on evil that never existed. This is the tragic story of power and shame. The image of a witch conjures up a wizened old woman surrounded by bubbling cauldrons and cackling laughter. Yet this caricature, a pale reflection of reality, didn't emerge in medieval times. It was a later invention. In real countings, what we call witchcraft was rooted in folk traditions, home remedies, and misunderstood rituals. Plainly social, not supernatural. But in an age where belief in miracles clashed with church authority, these harmless practices were dangerously ambiguous. To trace the roots of the witch trials, we journey back to 13th century Europe. The Catholic Church stood at its zenith, wielding spiritual and political dominance. Officially, the Church dismissed claims of witchcraft as superstition, silly credences of the uneducated. But at the same time, it wielded the power to condemn any deviation from orthodoxy. During the calamities of that era, plague, famine, war, fear seeped into societies, and during terror, even church leaders searched for explanations beyond natural causes. By the late 15th century, Europe was a tinderbox. The bubonic plague had devastated populations. The 100 Years' War had sown disenchantment. Political factions raged in skirmishes for power. It was in this unstable landscape that fear sought a scapegoat. Into this void entered Heinrich Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum. Published in 1487, this manual, translating to Hammer of Witches, was less theology than malicious propaganda. Kramer asserted that witchcraft was real, fueled by women's sinful temptation, and empowered by the devil. He insisted that witches were everywhere, bent on destroying the Christian order. He advocated for torture to extract confessions, even contradictory confessions, and justified execution as divine justice. It was a violent rewriting of reality. Kramer's book became the first blueprint for terror. He described the witch as a carnal, deceptive predator. He explained that confession might be false but must be believed. He turned God's compassion into relentless pursuit of evil. Initially, the church reaction was mixed. Some officials condemned Kramer's extremism, but political and theological chaos provided fertile ground. As the printing press spread the malice, its ideas inundated courts, universities, and small villages. The public, hungry for answers in chaotic times, accepted it uncritically. Across Germany, Switzerland, and Scotland, witch hunts escalated. Towns competed to demonstrate zeal in eradicating supposed evil. In the Italian city-states, inquisitors wielded Kramer's book to justify public trials. In Protestant territories, the malice became even more potent, used to purge any ceramic of popish superstition. By the early 1600s, tens of thousands stood accused. Estimates range from 60,000 to 100,000 put on trial. Women comprised roughly 70–80% of accused, and execution rates varied, but overall nearly half of those tried were condemned and killed. How did such widespread persecution happen? It began with accusation. Suspicion was sufficient. Rumor, malice, or misunderstanding could lead to a witch trial. The process was engineered for condemnation. Torture chambers enabled interrogators to extract confessions, which, in a cruel twist, became evidence of guilt. Spectral evidence, claims of dreams or visions inflicted by invisible witches, was admitted in several courts. In essence, the system was self-incriminating. Confess under pain, name others, and new suspects emerged. Deny, and you faced death nonetheless. Social breakdown fueled this machinery. Plague survivors saw deaths, crops failed, childbirths ended in tragedy, fortunes tipped through bad luck. When no rational explanation fit, people turned to whispers. Midwives became dangerous figures, blamed for infant death. Herbal healers, once respected, fell under suspicion when treatment failed. Widows who owned property intrigued greedy neighbors. Single women living outside family structures triggered fear in conservative communities. Each accusation was a polarization of fear into violence masked as piety. Even in educational centers, the collaborations of theologians, judges, and medical writers codified witch-hunting jurisprudence. Popes issued bulls reinforcing the reality of superstition. Princes issued edicts requiring investigation of suspected sorcery. Witch trials became not an exception but a policy instrument. And in many regions, witch hunting became a method of establishing moral authority. Yet behind the machinery lay heartbreak. Families torn apart, people tortured into madness, communities living in terror of midnight knock. Over and over, stories emerge. The midwife whose patient died, the smith's wife who spoke truth to power, the old woman with a birthmark, each condemned by rumor and fear. By the end of the 16th century, the seeds of the lie had taken root deeply across Europe. Witch hunts had become normalized, and the idea that fear, once unleashed, can become more powerful than reason, had taken hold. In bleak irony, a continent committed to salvation had turned to the machinery of murder in the name of it. The Salem trials are often cited as emblematic of witch hysteria, but their roots run deeper and far wider. Throughout Europe, the vast majority of accused witches were women, and that was no coincidence. These trials were less about magic and more about control, over property, speech, gender roles, and social conformity. First, consider who was accused: women outside the mainstream. Single women without male protectors, widows who inherited land, midwives wielding knowledge, older women with no children, outspoken women who dared to violate gender norms. These women failed to conform to the obedient, silent ideal of female existence. In a patriarchal society fearful of disorder, their independence was dangerous. Judges and preachers specifically targeted these groups. The Malleus Maleficarum itself argued that women were more susceptible to temptation, more deceitful, and more likely to collaborate with demons. It framed witchcraft as a feminine threat. That misogynistic theology provided religious justification for persecution. But it also had a secular logic. By eliminating these women, authorities consolidated their own power. Communities began targeting midwives, who delivered babies and held influence. If a child died, or an illness struck, suspicion fell on her. Healers using herbs were accused of poisoning or enchanting. Widows with property were easy prey, publicly tried, condemned, their land seized by local elites. In some German states, up to 50% of accused had no family or male advocate. Alone and unprotected, they were easy targets. The mechanisms of torture were invented for control. Forced to endure water ordeals, thumbscrews, sleep deprivation, simulated drownings. The purpose wasn't truth, it was submission. Under unbearable pain, women confessed to acts they never committed. Sexual liaisons with demons, farm sabotage, cursing livestock, flying on broomsticks to secret Sabbaths. Under further coercion, they named others, spawning more accusations. Neighbors turned on neighbors. The spectacle served as deterrent and control. Public burnings and hangings reinforced the idea: obedience, silence, conformity. Even women uninvolved learned the lesson. Children observed, witnesses trembled. Local elites acquired property and social influence. Church leaders increased their moral authority. Witch hunts became a tool of social engineering by fear. But while political control was key, misogyny fueled the furnace. Medical treatises declared women physiologically and psychologically inferior. The stereotypical witch, old, ugly, lonely, was contrasted with the idealized obedient wife. The more a woman defied expectations, the more she was perceived as unnatural, a threat to the divine order. Parallel gendered violence intensified with religious conflict. During the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, Protestant and Catholic rulers both used witch persecutions to demonstrate piety and control. Rival states competed in zeal. In Würzburg and Bamberg, trials led to mass executions. hundreds of accused killed in weeks. These regions became infamous. Entire districts depleted of women over 40. Few mediators challenged the courts, and any challenge was met with defiance or denial. Exceptions existed. Some local leaders intervened. The electorate of Brandenburg banned torture in 1625. Ministers in Enlightenment France and England later issued edicts limiting ecclesiastical courts. But the damage was done. By the time skepticism spread, tens of thousands had died. As persecution escalated, the logic became circular. Confession was torture-produced yet treated as truth. Fear created rumors, rumors created accusations. Accusations created confessions. Confessions justified executions. The underlying myth, that witches were real and dangerous, had become self-perpetuating. Yet this myth, rooted in misogyny and intolerance, created another casualty: trust. Community trust fractured as neighbors accused neighbors. Families turned inward, fearful of association. And publicly, women retreated, submitting to silence to survive. Looking back, we see more than injustice. We see a system designed to suppress voices that challenged power. Witch hunts were not accidental. They were deliberate. And they reveal how societies can weaponize fear, particularly against women, to maintain rigid control. By the late 17th century, cracks began to appear in the edifice of witch hysteria. Voices of reason, philosophers, lawyers, clergy, questioned the legitimacy of trials. Public tragedies, like Salem's Salem witch trials, shocked even those who once believed. In 1692, the Massachusetts colony held a series of trials culminating in 19 executions. Unlike in Europe, many of the accused were middle-class, connected individuals. Their deaths shook public confidence. As one historian put it, when accusations reached respectable families, belief in the witchcraft myth waned. Newspapers, letters, and pamphlets circulated criticism. Prominent figures, like Increase Mather, denounced spectral evidence. The self-inflicted tragedy forced a rethink. Back in Europe, rationalist currents gained strength. In 1700s England, Scotland, and Germany, legal scholars argued that courts must require empirical evidence. Torture was exposed as barbaric and unreliable. Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot attacked witch trial logic, denouncing superstition and advocating separation of church and state. As legal codes modernized, witchcraft was decriminalized. In 1735, Frederick the Great of Prussia formally abolished trials for witchcraft. Other rulers followed. Perhaps the last official execution took place in Switzerland in 1782, when Anna Goldie was hanged for bewitching a girl. Today, her death is widely considered a judicial murder, a grim symbol of the lingering power of the lie. By the early 19th century, witch trials had become politically and morally untenable. Yet the legacy extended beyond executions. The myth of the witch found new forms. Witchcraft moved from courtrooms into popular culture. Fairy tales, plays, pamphlets, shaped to warn or entertain. The witch became a villain in children's stories, a seductive femme fatale in Gothic novels, later a misunderstood outsider in feminist literature. Even into the 20th and 21st centuries, witch hunt remains shorthand for political persecution, McCarthyism, political purges, media disinformation campaigns. What deep truth lies at the core of the witch hunts? It wasn't about curses or broom rides. It was a tale of fear weaponized by power, of misogyny portrayed as morality, and of misinformation wielded to unify through persecution. Once societies embrace lies, especially about unseen enemies, they build prisons of fear. The witch hunts hold crucial lessons for today. They remind us that societies under pressure, economic collapse, political instability, pandemics, often turn to scapegoats. Accusation becomes currency. Dissent becomes dangerous. When rumor overrides law and fear overrides justice, innocent lives pay the price. Modern parallels are chilling. Immigrant scapegoating, disinformation campaigns in politics, public moral panics over speech or identity. In every era, the pattern emerges. Crisis leads to fear, fear leads to suspicion, suspicion leads to persecution. The targets change, but the mechanism stays. Witch hunts did not end, they evolved. And yet, understanding the horror and unmasking the lies offers hope. The Enlightenment's rise proved that reason, empathy, and institutional safeguards can dismantle fear. Free speech challenged rumor. Legal reform outlawed torture. Education replaced superstition. But these gains remain fragile. History shows how quickly societies can reverse. As we close this tale, consider the voices silenced. Remember that women burned at the stake, families destroyed, communities terrorized were no witches. They were ordinary people caught in a web of lies. And know this, the only way to stop history from repeating is to expose it, to challenge fear with truth, and to protect the vulnerable when society turns suspicious. If this journey into the truth behind witch hunts moved you, if it shocked you, unsettled you, or opened your eyes, share this story. Let others know what textbooks often gloss over. Subscribe for more untold chapters of history. Leave a comment about what surprised you most. Was it the scale, the gender angle, or how fear spread? And tell us which dark truths we should uncover next. History repeats when lies go unchallenged, so help us shine a light.